Tēnā koutou, and hara mai. My name's Jeff Fox, I'm Senior Curator here. Andy introduced himself as a bit of a newbie, but I'm even newer newbie, if you like. I've been here since January, and learning really what it's like to work in a very strong community from a national organisation. So I find this really great opportunity to hear about all your experiences as well, working with communities, engaging communities, and making them part of our institutions. I'd just like to thank National Services Te Pairangi for their support of the Hui, and also Tony and Susanna especially for their amazing work in helping to organise the Hui. So the theme for this year's Middle Earth Hui, Collections and Collaborations, it's intrinsic to who we are as museums and galleries, as kaitiaki and communicators, as hubs for community participation, creation, learning and fun. We help build strong communities. Collaboration can be a messy, dirty, unpleasant, sort of hard thing. It's a sexy thing, but it requires attributes of patience, determination, and most importantly, an open mind. From an institutional perspective, collaborations can be very risky, but extremely rewarding. Challenging assumptions, provoking and inspiring, innovative and novel practices, and building long-term relationships. Today's keynote speaker is Associate Professor Heather Galbraith, who's head of the School of Art, Massey University. She's well versed in the art and practice of collaboration through her current role, and in previous roles as Senior Curator at City Gallery Wellington and Senior Curator at Te Papa, and earlier roles at St Paul Street Gallery and in the UK. She's heavily involved in practice-based research mentoring. Today, Heather will discuss case studies to help flesh out key and urgent questions related to innovative curatorial practice involving community engagement, collaboration, or contextual exhibitionary structures in Aotearoa and internationally. So I'd like you to please join me in warmly welcoming Heather to Manawa and the Middle Earth Curatorial Hui.
Ena matuaka o te motu tēnā koutou katoa, ena mana, ena waka na hui wha, tēnā koutou katoa. Ena manahiri nau mai hari mai, kia koutou katoa. Thank you very much, Jeff, for that introduction, and thanks also to Andy, Tony and Susanna for undertaking this fairly massive achievement of putting together such a rich hui. You make it all look seamless. I'm going to use the sort of swan metaphor in terms of, calm on the outside, legs paddling furiously under the water, which as curators, we kind of know that mirage, I would say. Today, we're going to have quite a strong contemporary art focus, which I acknowledge and realise is not the place that all of you are coming from as curatorial practitioners. But I think there are going to be aspects of what I'm going to talk about, bring up, and case studies that will be relevant to your individual practices. But what a brilliant opportunity it is for us to talk as curators. How often does this actually get to happen when we get together as a group and be generous, but also be hopefully free and frank with our experiences so that we can learn from one another. Having worked as a museum and gallery curator for 15 years prior to making the move into an art school university environment, I recognise that these opportunities are sometimes all too rare. Whereas now, I get to talk about stuff a lot. But I get to do projects a lot more infrequently, so the balance has kind of shifted in my world. So I'll probably be the one looking on wistfully when you start talking about your projects and the troubles and struggles and the possibilities that you're trying to engender. So today, we've got a little bit of a New Zealand artist, Dane Mitchell, sort of metaphorically kicking us off on the front slide here, which is a project that he was invited to do for the very recent 2012 Liverpool Biennial called The Unexpected Guest, which was curated by a gentleman called Lorenzo Fusi, but was under the artistic directorship of an extremely interesting woman called Sally Tallant, who used to run the education programs at the Serpentine Gallery for over more than sort of 15 years. And she's definitely someone that I would encourage you to have a look at as a very innovative practitioner, melding imperatives of education, artists in residence, and exhibitionary projects. But we'll get back to Sally and Liverpool a little bit later. So I've approached this presentation from two angles. One is sharing thoughts on possible approaches to curating process-based, collaborative or participatory works or projects. And the other is responding to a recently published text, which I would thoroughly recommend, and it's the green book at the bottom of the pile of my books that I brought up if anyone wants to have a flick through later, by an Australian thinker, art historian. He's not a curator, but he writes about curating, called Terry Smith. And it's called Thinking Contemporary Curating, which he sees, he makes an analogy to one of Bruce Naumann's word works in terms of the order of those three words could be in any order, and the meaning of their relationship shifts. And so I think that's interesting for us to remain kind of flexible and fluid in terms of the issues and topics that we're going to be talking about today. So Smith, he writes very cleanly and concisely while grappling with some pretty big, chewy issues. But he also very successfully in this book manages to weave together thinking about issues that are contextual, social, ethical and philosophical in relation to projects and texts that acknowledge but amazingly don't become weighed down by issues of logistics and resourcing. So I encourage us today, or at least for this morning, this moment, to be partially released from dwelling on the how the hell do I make this happen, and instead spend some time on thinking about what do we really want to achieve through our curatorial projects and activities, and create a space within this hui to consider options critically, conceptually and contextually for exploring the idea of curating the contemporary. So yeah, I'm going to look at quite a raft of case studies, and I'll talk directly to them as we go, and they very intentionally combine or mix international examples with examples that have been realised here. Some of Terry's key questions in his book, which I'd just like us to kind of consider, include, when it comes to showing art, do curators think in ways that are unique to their profession? Can curatorial thought be distinguished from the thinking processes within the myriad of closely related practices, especially art criticism, art history, and art making? And from curating within other kinds of museum or display spaces, public or private? Just what exactly is contemporary curatorial thought? Smith brings forward 7 points by the English-born Australian curator Nick Waterlow, who some of you who may have gone to Sydney Biennales would recognise his name. And he scribed this in an eerily prescient way just shortly before his death in 2009. And it was titled A Curator's Last Will and Testament. And the 7 points that Waterlow outlines is 1, passion. 2, an eye of discernment. 3, an empty vessel. 4, this is an important one, an ability to be uncertain. 5, belief in the necessity of art and artists. 6, a medium, bringing a passionate and informed understanding of works of art to an audience in ways that will stimulate, inspire and question. And 7, make possible the altering of perception. So Smith holds alongside these impulses outlined by Waterlow that there are some other urgencies at the moment for us to attend to, including rethinking spectatorship, engaging viewers as co-curators, and the challenge of curating contemporaneity itself in its present, past and future forms. He goes on to cite placemaking and world picturing and connectivity as very, very common concerns of artists these days. but they're common concerns of artists because they're common concerns of our contemporary existence. And they often take prominence over other distinctions or taxonomies based on media, style, mode, or ideology. He also suggests that the object of contemporary curating is much larger than what is made right now, and that our working context extends into the past and into the future. Like contemporary art, this is Smith, contemporary curating is embroiled in time but not bound by it, entangled with periodizing urges but not enslaved to them, committed to space but of many kinds, actual and virtual, anxious about place, yet thrilled by dispersion's rollercoaster ride. It does not follow a set of rules, rather it adopts an approach arising from an emergent set of attitudes. Can we say that the purpose of curating today is something like this? To exhibit, in the broad sense of show, offer, enable the experience of. Contemporary presence and the currency that is contemporaneity as they are manifest in art present, past and multi-temporal, even atemporal. Okay, so this work of Dane's here is part of a project that he did, which was a site-responsive project at the Liverpool Biennial, where he was collecting and channeling ghost stories from the local area to where his project was located, and he was recanting them into the glass vessels as they were being blown. So the vessels became the holders of these moments of urban story or myth. So the stories were forever captured there, but of course it's a very kind of poetic gesture rather than one that has a strong kind of literal unpacking. But sometimes I think talking about curating feels a little bit like capturing sort of spoken word or whispers in a glass vial. Some more questions. There's always so many questions, and often we don't get answers, we just get better questions. I'll leave you just a couple of seconds, but I won't read it out loud. It's one of my allergies, is people reading out loud from texts on PowerPoints. But give me a bit of a hooray when you're done. We're there? Yeah, I see a nod from the back. Thank you very much, kind sir. And this is when I leave the PowerPoint afterwards. Those are all live links, so I'm not going to go into them now, but it's really useful when you're being presented with new projects to be able to have a shortcut to head there yourself to investigate at a later time. And that was just empty page, so I started to fill up with the very last image, last sort of web link there, which is an extraordinary project called Living as Form, which is by Creative Time in New York, where they did the extraordinary thing of not only documenting projects from 1991 to 2011 in very, very detailed form from around the world, but also then creating an exhibition of an archive and temporal new commissions and a book. So it was one of those extraordinarily rich projects, but ones that are always interesting in terms of process-based works. How do you record them, how do you document them, and how do you represent them in other contexts? So the first case study I'd like to look at is one that took place up and down the country. Was anyone involved in any of the one-day sculpture projects, or did anyone have a chance to see any of them that took place up and down New Zealand? Andy, yes. A couple. Yeah, okay. So this was a fairly nutty project in the best possible way, and that it came out of a curatorial residency that Claire Doherty from Situations in Bristol came and did with David Cross at Massey University, Wellington, which I can say happened before I was there, so this isn't me like bigging up my own institution. But I have to also admit that I curated one of the projects, the Amy Howden Chapman project. But it sought to bring together a national temporal sculptural commissioning project that would take place over the period of 1 year, but that each project would only last within a 24-hour period. And it involved commissioning institutions up and down the country, I think from Auckland to Dunedin, but it also involved independent curators working outside of institutions as well. And this is the list of artists, of which you will probably recognise some New Zealand names, but also some of the international artists who have also done work in other contexts in New Zealand. So I'm going to show you 3 projects from this. This is Heather and Ivan Morrison's project called Journée de Barricades, which was located in Wellington on a Sunday. And there was this ginormous barricade that was erected, interestingly, site-wise, right outside. You might recognise this as the old Public Trust building. It's CNZ's offices that were before the quake. And then there's the old Department of Defence buildings on the right-hand side. But these 2 artists who are a couple but always work together, wanted to instill this structure of protest, but with the ambiguity that we didn't know what they were protesting about or what the nature of the conflict was. And so it was up by about 5 a.m. On the morning of the Sunday, and by 5 a.m. on the morning of the Monday it was completely gone. And it wasn't announced in media. It was extremely interesting how close they played the leak or the kind of promotion of information, because it was really important that this work was as much of a kind of surprise and a kind of crazy encounter, an unexpected encounter as possible. So from one type of monumentalism to another, this is Billy Apple's project called Less is More, which was also a Wellington-based one, and it related to Billy bringing attention to the fact, or his opinion, that the way that the Henry Moore in the Botanical Gardens had been treated in terms of its preservation and patina was not according to the artist's wishes. So this was this giant billboard kind of drawing attention of the Wellington City Council, which was interesting because the Wellington City Council were, of course, a key participant and agent of collaboration within the one-day sculpture projects that took place in Wellington. But it did bring to the surface a really interesting and urgent kind of issue, and led to more conversation and discussion about the ongoing care and maintenance of this particular piece of public sculpture. So a temporary act, really engaging quite a particular focused community in a way, or target community, but also bringing to the surface issues of invisibility of so many public sculptures within urban contexts and their care and maintenance. And finally, Paola Pivi, an Italian artist, a project called I Wish I Am Fish. And this was, this caused an enormous amount of controversy. You may have seen it in the papers. But the story was that these fish had flown from Australia to New Zealand, and you could go to an airport in Auckland and have an encounter with these said goldfish. So anyone who's ever tried to make artworks with live animals in them will know that it's a very hot topic for discussion in terms of ethical issues and the well-being of said animals. But again, this was quite a poetic gesture, and one which, as an audience, you had to work quite hard to engage with. So unlike the Stout Street barricade, where you could literally stumble across it, this was a much more kind of nuanced and intentional kind of viewer experience. I believe they didn't fly from Australia. I don't think they're Australian goldfish. I believe they flew around a little bit and then landed, but they were airborne. Yes. So another project which grew out of the kind of curatorial structuralism of one-day sculpture was a project called Iteration Again. And again, this is an example of a curator not really making it easy for themselves. In this case, there are 13 projects that were realised in Tasmania within a 1-month period. Each of them were 4 weeks long, and each of them had to change 4 times during that project. And David Cross, again, was the curatorial director on this one, but he also curated, I think, about 6 of the projects as well. So he was curating curators and curating artists, which is not an easy combination necessarily. But this project by James Newitt called My Secession Party is one that I thought was particularly interesting because he held a series of parades and kind of mechanisms for him to gather or harness the energies and the support of the community in this particular area of Hobart to encourage him to secede for the period of 2.5, 3 weeks. So he was giving up his citizenship. He was no longer going to classify himself as a citizen of Australia or a resident of Hobart, and so he lived on this raft in the middle of this man-made lake for 2.5 weeks with a tree, a sort of potted palm, and obviously some kind of self-composting facilities, but people would go down to the lake to try and engage with him or entertain him. There was a regular bagpipist, I don't know if that's the right descriptor, who would come down of his own accord and play for him. There were opera singers. The cheer squad was facilitated, but the number of people that actually genuinely invested kind of care and concern in James was extraordinary. And this is just the chronological route of him kind of heading off and then coming back in the windiest, crappiest, rainiest day where he barely made it to shore in his little blow-up dinghy, and then there was the ubiquitous barbecue with sausages at the end. This is a project by Lucy Bleach, which had 4 quite distinct iterations. So this was not something that was kind of an amorphous, ongoing complex, but rather Lucy had chosen a lane in Hobart's central business district, and the first project was a neon pink pigeon sign which got turned on. The next week, a set of concrete steps were delivered by a large truck, upon which was put a Vinnie's clothing bin, which members of the community were asked to donate used clothing to. So that was another week. Then the bin was emptied of all of its contents, and it was an incredibly generous donation of clothing, which was then transformed by the artist and the costume designer into this extraordinary large cloak. After all of the clothing had been, you can see, there's the pointer, right there, that's the clothing kind of stacked up in a local store window just beside the steps. So here we have an extraordinary sort of torch singer called Rebecca Del Rio, who was convinced to fly over from the States to sing laments, to talk about laments that talked about displacement and homelessness or being away from home. And this is her singing. She'd come every day for a week and sing her laments. And then on the final day, so she was no longer there, but in came 120 homing pigeons, which sat in their snazzy little portable, cages, and then were released as the final act of the project, and took, I believe, 9 minutes to get from this location back to their home. So for them it was a very, very direct re-encounter with their place of belonging. But for the rest of the people experiencing this project, I would argue, again, it was a very interesting and multifaceted and layered evolution of discussions of what it is to belong and to be located in a particular place. Extremely quickly, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Venice Biennale this year, which was curated by Massimiliano Gioni, the Deputy Director of the New Museum in New York. But one of the things which I thought was extraordinary and quite brilliant of Massimiliano is that he, after getting this, like, one of the most highly prized curatorial gigs globally, he gave some of it away. He was like, I don't need all of it. I'm going to invite an artist to curate something. So Cindy Sherman curated a section of the curated exhibition within the Arsenale, which is this kind of mad, long, kind of naval buildings, which you're walking, you can't think that you can possibly see or take in any more art, and then you turn a corner and it's the same distance again. And it was just before that corner turning moment that this section of the exhibition was located, and there was a palpable sea change of emotion, of texture, of density of work, and it was just terrifically exciting, and I thought showed quite a lot of courage on Massimiliano's behalf to just go, yep, we'll just give that over to an extraordinary artist, but not someone who is renowned for, you know, making oodles of curatorial projects. And all of the work related to use of the figure and exploration of the sense of many things, of sexuality, of physicality, of relationships with siblings, with families, with partners. This is the extraordinary work of a very senior Italian artist called Carol Rama. We've got Adrian Searle checking out one of the labels there. But it was just really luscious and used a lot of found material that wasn't authored by any artists, and mixed those aspects of visual and material culture with artwork in a really, really lively and extraordinary way. And then directly after that, there was a sequencing of works which was much more kind of symptomatic, I think, of Massimiliano's curatorial style. So just so that you can see a little bit of the disjunct between those two languages, we'll run through a sequence of projects. So this is Ryan Tregarten, Wade Guyton. These are large abstract paintings made by putting canvas through a ginormous inkjet printer, which glitches and fails on the canvas surface. Simon Denny, a depiction of now moribund analogue broadcasting technology, and Helen Martin. Otto Pieni, a member of the Zero group, and then two in the same room, heavy hitters with Dieter Roth and Bruce Nauman. And then just ending on little Walter de Maria, you know. It was like absolutely, but here you've got kind of big, monolithic, grunty projects, which are quite a distinct contrast to the intensity and detail of the Sherman approach. Also within the pavilions were some incredibly interesting performative aspects, including a collaboration between Cyprus and Lithuania, which had never happened before, where two artists, two countries had worked in this large gymnasium, again never used as a venue at Venice before, and had instigated a collaborative suite of actions and objects. But also the Romanian pavilion, which sought to reenact a really large chunk, not every single project or artwork that had happened within the 150-year history of the Venice Biennale, but every single day these 5 performers were in the space, introducing and remaking to the best of their ability either artworks or political or social scenarios that affected the Venice Biennale. And then two more just quickly. Portugal, an artist called Johanna or now we go, Vasconcelos, I want to say. Correct me, any of those of you with excellent Portuguese. And then Angola, a photographer called Edson Chagas. And Angola won the Pavilion of Merit, the Silver Lion for the Pavilion of Merit, which was kind of interesting and a little bit controversial, but because they were a first-time entry, they'd never shown at the Biennale before. But Joanna went, I don't want a venue, I'm going to bring a boat. So her venue was the vessel, and this was the interior of the vessel that you could engage with and spend time in. And it was also moving, so it was even more sort of sensorially disconcerting. And this project here, you collected the images printed by Chagas and curated your own exhibition or publication, which you then removed. So at the end of the Biennale, there will be no residue left apart from what now exists in people's homes. It's also they were really big, and so you just saw a whole lot of people struggling with kind of posters around, and then the horrible moment of seeing them ending up in rubbish bins as well, before people realised that they weren't necessarily able to take them home in their luggage. But people, there was like a feeding frenzy on this. I was really not completely convinced by the work. I didn't think that the images, I thought the images were fine, but they weren't extraordinary. But what was slightly gross about it was the feeding frenzy of people just trying to gather up as much as they possibly could of free stuff, and then not necessarily take care of what they then did with those objects. Liverpool Biennial, so it's one of the major temporary commissioning biennials in the world. And I've had the fortune of probably seeing 3 of them now. And this one included fantastically representation by David Benowith, William Sue and Marnie Slater, 3 New Zealand practitioners. But I was pretty underwhelmed by aspects of this. There were some incredibly strong projects and others which just seemed a little bit surface, a little bit token. And one of the ones that I was less convinced by was the Superflex project up on the top left-hand side, which was essentially the gathering together of the plethora of real estate agent signs within central Liverpool. Liverpool's been going through kind of periods of trying desperately to be kind of re-energised and re-gentrified, but there's still an amazing amount of empty real estate in the central city. On the top right is Jose Angel Vincenz, which was, spells exile, but these were little mobile sleeping pods that you could book time in, and sure enough, when I saw it, there was one was completely fogged up, so someone had obviously was in there. And on the bottom left-hand side is a project by Elm Green and Dragset, which was this golden mirrored VIP door with a bouncer outside of it, just in the middle of the street. This to me was like a bit of a one-liner, a little bit of a joke. And interestingly, I note it's just been in the Frieze Sculpture Park, which seems perhaps a more interesting and tense kind of context to show it in, with the tensions between echelons of art markets, etc. Some more projects there: Jemima Wyman, Patrick Murphy, Dan Graham and Doug Aitken. They were fine, but there was often just a bit too cursory an engagement with context of site and of community. This was a knockout work that's currently showing in the physics room in Christchurch, or may have just closed. But again, it was in fact in Liverpool, beautifully installed, but essentially a exhibition that could have taken place absolutely anywhere. It didn't need to be located within a Biennale site engaged or responsive context. However, this one was fascinating. So this is Jana van Heijsbeek, who's a Dutch artist, who has worked extensively and tirelessly in terms of constructing amazingly robust community engaged projects. And this is a project called 2 Up, 2 Down, Home Baked, and it is in the extremely tough neighbourhood of Anfield. Not tough because of the people that live there, but tough because of what Anfield has been through in terms of buildings being decimated, sort of, supposed slum clearances, the Anfield Stadium being constructed, but kind of being plopped into a community, and a loss of local amenities that took place as part of that process of being kind of made over or made under, really. So here Jana worked with local residents to really kind of understand or get a sense of how, what are the local amenities that really needed to be brought back into a community to symbolise a sense of life, a sense of vibrancy, and the community identified that a bakery was what they felt was going to do that. So there was the bakery, which says brick by brick, loaf by loaf, we build ourselves, which is a lovely banner, but also in tandem with that, Jana was working with residents and the council as a facilitator to talk about how to create better housing that was much better suited for local residents. So there was this moment of baking and sharing food, as well as trying to grapple with really tough issues of better housing redevelopments that were actually going to suit the needs of existing populace rather than be all about gentrification and the incoming of a new, more affluent populace. But this is a 3-year project, and I don't know how much it cost. But it required the dedication of the artist for that length of time, but also the dedication of all of her community participants and volunteers. And I think this is one of the stumbling blocks that we all come up against with participatory projects, is how to ensure that the resourcing is available for those long-term commitments and those evolving projects. Scape. Has anyone been down to see Scape? Just me then. Oh yes, a couple, brilliant, excellent. So you guys chip in. So curated by Blair French, and this was Scape 7. So Scape 6 was of course hit by the devastating earthquakes, but kind of happened in sort of slow release form, project by project over a period of time. And Blair was also involved with that. But this is the first kind of total scape post-quake. And of course the context of what you want temporal public art to do within the city of Christchurch has changed dramatically. But also interestingly, what has changed is the climate through which temporary public projects are already happening with institutions like Gap Filler. There's another one called Vacant Spaces. And Gap Filler, I think, is extremely interesting because they don't purport to be artists. They often involve artists within their projects or involve designers or other forms of types of creative practitioners. But they see it very much as a community activism-based social project rather than one that's exclusively art-led. However, Scape defines itself as being an art project. And here we've got a range of, this is not categorical by any means, there were many, many more. So Flauntatiousness by Wayne Yule, with this very snazzy American car, which was loaned for the period of Scape and included all of the sponsors' logos, but then Wayne also designed logos for all of the artists as well, as if they were commodities. And that didn't necessarily go down well with some of the artists, who kind of didn't know that that was going to happen, or kind of didn't understand, or were kind of really perplexed by how they were depicted as a corporate entity. And yeah, I think, but no one could drive the car. Wayne wasn't allowed to drive the car. So it was kind of weird. It was like one way to integrate those kind of sponsor thank yous, which are essential for any of these kind of temporary projects, in a way that was a little bit more kind of vibrant. But I'm not convinced by its efficacy as an artwork, to be honest. And then up the top here is works by Fiona Connor and Dan Arps, which were just around the corner from the physics room, which is in that building there, and C1 Espresso, which is kind of this mad social hub because it's really hard to get coffee really good coffee in Christchurch, so that's where you can go. And so this was a big kind of, completely gravel-infused empty lot. But what you don't see here is that there was a bike repair project, another gap filler project. There were three, and a home composting, an urban composting project that all started to kind of interestingly occupy the periphery of this empty site. So there was a really interesting kind of collision between community initiatives and the scape artwork that wasn't altogether comfortable or kind of harmonious, but it showed, I guess, that there were different registers and different issues at play. This is a global project by an artist called Misha Kubal, where he recites street lamps from, I think it's going to be 23 cities around the world into a single stretch by Hagley Park. So there'll be all these different kind of moments or kind of tokens of light from different urban contexts around the world that will illuminate this stretch of Christchurch. And this project here is by Zena Swanson, where she has invited 6 specialists that work either in the area of landscape design or botany or geology to talk, to be hypnotised in public and to channel the thoughts of a plant in that particular site or location. So this is a young woman who is channeling the thoughts of a lupin. Which is directly in front of her, and the hypnotist, I can't remember his name, but he was pretty fantastic. He is a registered hypnotist. That's what he does for a living, and so he was asking the sitter questions, and the sitter was answering them in first person as if she was the plant, and the transcripts of those hypnotism sessions are now online on the Scape site and make really fascinating reading. And then finally, a sort of semi-permanent work by Julia Morrison, which was within the Scape kind of hub, which effectively was a whole lot of white kind of screens and 2 porta cabins, I think that was it, and some gravel. And a lot was made that the Scape Hub was going to be this amazing site for conversation and meeting and socialising and kind of engaging with the thick and chewy issues of temporary site-based commissioning. But it didn't feel like it was performing that role particularly convincingly. And it kind of felt like Julia's work was being quite hemmed and fenced. So yeah, again, I really liked aspects of the project, but there were others that I was less keen on. 2 of the more sort of far-flung and kind of highly dynamic projects, Maddie Leach working with local ham radio specialists to try and communicate with this orbiting space stations, as there was an American space station and a Russian space station as they were passing over Christchurch. And they were broadcasting to them fragments from the Christchurch Sound Archives, so 32 fragments of local sound history, trying to make contact with the space stations. And then the bottom one, David Cross designing a brand new game called Power Slide, which you had to climb over, run basically over the top, across the top, and then dive down a chute on the other side. But you had one team doing that and another team inside the structure pulling on ropes or to try and destabilise your passage across the top surface of the form. And it's become fiercely competitive. Corporate sports teams have bought into it with a vengeance, and they're currently, the top score is 40 runs across the top within a 10-minute period. But David went to the absolute whole hog in terms of devising rules, the scoreboards there, a whole new sport culture has been created through this really strange inflatable spectacle. Grisdale is an incredibly interesting project. It's based in Cumbria, in the very, very north of England, on the border between England and Scotland. And they have been working for over a decade now. I think it's possibly even more like two, to work with a very, very local community, which is one of the local area. And they have just begun with their residencies and commissioning projects, to instigate a principle that every project that gets realised through Grisdale has to do some form of good for the local community or area. So we've got a kind of here a structure where you can go and do anything you like in the structure. It's like a meeting space. It's actually a lot bigger than it looks, so I quite like the primal screen therapy. It's one of the options you can work with in that structure. A very kind of now common trope of the meal as event, but I was more interested in the paddy fields project here, where a group of farmers from a Japanese village of Toge visited the site and taught cultivated terracing of vegetables to the Grisdale coordinators, and that's been ongoing as a food productive site. And then the cheese production mobile unit, also named the Mobile Dairy School, which was an artist, Fernando Garcia Dori, ran with mobile cheese making workshops, cheese design and propaganda. I'd quite like to see what cheese propaganda looks like. Very, very influenced by the Krausist movement in Spain, and interested in issues of empowering local knowledge to be able to be transferred to other sites and contexts. Archangel London, you couldn't get two more different scales of operation, from the tiny, tiny, incredibly locally embedded Grisdale rural arts organisation through to Archangel in London, which instigates huge scale projects. This one, Smothered by Sarah Cole, was a project that took place across a 3 or 5 story house on King's Cross Road, and was a project that was a collaboration with a group of parents from age 14 to their mid-20s, so young parents and their children, which was facilitated through weekly drop-in sessions for a long period of time, about 9 or 10 months, that Sarah then devised and worked with a composer to devise a suite of sort of repeating actions and performances based on the experiences of the young parents and their children. Through to The Battle or Grave, which is a work from 2001 but still stands out as an absolutely extraordinarily ambitious and massively contentious and difficult project instigated by Jeremy Deller, where he sought to, in the tradition of military recreations, which seem to be quite strongly represented in Britain, but even more so in the US, he reenacted a conflict between the National Union of Mine Workers in around 1984 and the riot police. And interestingly, this was documented by the director Mike Figgis and aired in 2002 on Channel 4 as a film work. But within this work, the people of Orgrave weren't necessarily cast as their original context or positions. So you had miners playing policemen and policemen playing miners, which really complicated the scenario. But if you look online, there's lots of YouTube excerpts from this work, but the intensity of the experience way back in 1984 certainly is still amazingly fresh, and it sort of signalled an epoch or a time of radical community change that people are still trying to contend with and are reeling from. And then finally something a little bit more lyrical from Art Angel. This is Roger Heorns. I don't know how many of you in your science projects at school had a little experiment with some copper sulfate solution. But in this project, 75,000 litres of copper sulfate were pumped into a council flat, an abandoned council flat in South London, and left to grow. So this is the entire interior of the flat, encrusted with these copper sulfate crystals, and you could book times to go and walk through the flat. Interestingly, this project was nominated for the Turner Prize in 2009, and has now been relocated to Bothy Garden at the Yorkshire Sculpture Park. So what was a temporal project has now become one that can be experienced in an ongoing context. A couple of other projects. Mexican artist Francis Alice, a Mexican-Belgian artist, lives in Mexico but he's Belgian. A series of 7 walks documented through video or print-based ephemera, which takes us, so we get rid of these sort of organisations that, or put them to one side, don't get rid of them because they're valuable, organisations that solely look at temporary commissioning. And let's just graze quickly through some interventions that artists have made in museums, or when artists have made their own museums. So here 2 kind of seminal early projects with Fred Wilson and Joseph Kossuth. Are any of you familiar with these projects? They often get brought out for lots of museum studies papers, but they are both of their time incredibly significant and groundbreaking in terms of the rethinking of histories of collecting and acquisition and the politics of display and collection management. So I won't go into oodles of detail, but I did want to talk about a couple of artist-instigated museums from very different contexts, time-wise. The Marcel Brutaer Museum of Modern Art Department of Eagles from 1972, and I was very fortunate to see that project at Documenta X or Documenta 10 in 2007, where it hadn't lost any of its potency and edge. It was still extraordinary. And the Museum of Jurassic Technology in Los Angeles. Are any of you familiar with this extraordinary place? Has anyone been? If so, I'm really jealous, because I've always wanted to go. But the Museum of Jurassic Technology is a space instigated by David Wilson, which is now probably at least 15 years old, if not 20 years old. But he's created a museum which completely mixes up languages of science and creationism to be fantastically lateral and lyrical, but deeply confusing, particularly, I think, if you were a creationist, I think it would be. There's like plans for Noah's Ark and some strange kind of hybridity that is presented with absolute deadly seriousness and rigour, and using all the kind of display tropes that are common to traditional museology. But artists don't just make their own museums, they also like to truck around with the ones that invite them to make or do projects. And here are 3 quite different energies of intervention. So the top work here, Andrea Fraser, Museum Highlights, a Gallery Talk, was a key work, late 1980s, this is 1989, where she took on the role of tour guide, but toured the visitors not only through the official museum display spaces, but also back of house, but also brought up, she's there touring the water cooler. So toured often and spoke to the context of spaces that were particularly, utilitarian or mundane. But in doing so, unpacked a number of politics of the museum as social space, the museum's history of donorship or of funding or infrastructure. Whereas here, Carsten Holler in the Turbine Hall, invites us to have a terrifying experience by actually entering into his slide work. So this was called Test Site, and I wasn't in the UK at this time, so was never able to do it, but the whole idea of it just actually makes me feel completely sick. The height of the turbine hall is vertiginous, so the steepness of angles of these works were extraordinary. And then this work here on the left-hand side is by Tino Segal, and even by doing this I'm like breaking an art code, because Tino always says that he does not want his work documented. There are never labels. He always has his performance works just based in a space, in a context, and in this case it's sitting alongside some extraordinary informatics by Rudolf Steiner in terms of learning systems. So it was an amazing juxtaposition of two different types of experiential learning and understanding: Tino's dance and movement and sung performance works, and then the Steiner works as well. Very, very quickly, a couple of examples much closer to home. Peter Robertson's If You Were to Work Here, The Mood in the Museum, which was part of the Auckland Triennial earlier this year, and I believe may still be, I don't know whether the sticks are still up in place within the Auckland Museum, but these were mood sticks, red, green, yellow and blue, and they were referencing Hippocratic medicine as the colour mood system of how it related to your sense of wellness or lack of wellness. And these sticks were transferred from the Auckland Art Gallery in a hikoi up to the museum, were laid in the foyer, and then it was up to the museum staff to identify which of the sticks and the colours and the symbolic aspect of those colours, like one was melancholia, another one was, I think it was phlegmatic, which most represented their state, their feeling, and then they placed them within the context of the museum, both within the display spaces and the non-display spaces. And through reading the coding, and this was just after a time where the museum had gone through extraordinary restructure, and there was still, you can tell, there's a settling that's still in play. So there were some incredibly beautiful and poignant and kind of heart-wrenching placements of these objects. And then Local Time, which is a collective of Natalie Robertson, Danny Butt, Alex Monteith, artists and art writers and thinkers based in Auckland, and now Danny's based in Australia. But here they worked with local iwi to access the Rauwharangi spring, which is just at the north side of Albert Park. And for every single public program or a gesture of hospitality, of giving water to speakers within the Triennale, they were using the waters of the Rauwharangi spring, which was a very lovely gesture, but also something that, when you normally get the bottled water out from wherever it might be, speaks to really interesting issues of locality. And knowing and being embedded within your local area. So the final suite of examples I'm going to just not talk to, but they're all related to the Living as Form exhibition in New York. But rather, I'm just going to finish with a little bit of a sense of what are the questions that we could maybe talk to directly now, or what are some of the urgent issues when we consider working in process-based ways within our context. And one that we've already identified is resourcing, but I think resourcing is it's not the side issue, but it really is being able to compel and convince the people that are engaged with programming your spaces and allocating budget that these projects are really worthwhile and important whether it's instead of or alongside or even as part of more static or conventional exhibition, interior, museum or gallery based projects and shows. Because my experience is that anything that becomes tricky and expensive and time consuming and complex are often the first things that get cut. So one thing is to talk about what are the strengths in working in this way, and how can we influence, I guess, and if we are in those positions of making decisions about how budget gets allocated and what the values and priorities of an institution are, how we can have those internal monologues, because it's sometimes extremely challenging when we're making those decisions and it becomes an either-or scenario rather than an and scenario. But one of the other things that is, I think, really sung in terms of any process-based collaborative or contextual temporal projects is how they're documented and how we record them and archive them beyond the pictures that look great in PowerPoints. How do we actually write curatorially the experience of these projects so that there's the institutional knowledge, but also that we can share our process? So this is not necessarily writing for the public realm, writing to maintain the illusion that everything went completely smoothly and there wasn't a hiccup at all and nothing changed from yay to nay. But I think that documenting of our curatorial practice and that sharing of it is really, really important. I think the opportunity to co-curate with artists or to invite artists or other creative practitioners into the curatorial space is incredibly, incredibly exciting. But that also means that we need to be ready to give up a degree of agency or to share that agency. I think we absolutely need to rethink and continue to rethink. I know this is already in play, and indeed the words of both Andy and Jeff really expanded upon this, but rethink issues of spectatorship and audience and our relationship with our viewers as co-curators, as participants, and the challenges of how working in that way actually manifests. So, you know, we're in a position to reimagine and reshape the way we work in ways that we kind of might have aspirations for, but it's also okay if we don't know exactly where we're going. And so that's coming right back to Terry Smith's, or it wasn't Terry, it was Nick's comment about the importance of being able to be uncertain. It isn't about being unfocused, but it's just about asking questions we don't yet know the answers to. That's me for the presentation. Hooray! So I think we've got about 20 minutes for some facilitated discussions, but I mean, particularly when I was talking about issues of resourcing, there are a few nodding heads around the room. What would be incredibly useful is perhaps if people would be willing to share or talk to projects that they either wanted to do or began doing and felt compromised or thwarted through that process, or even examples of when things went brilliantly but in a way that you didn't expect or anticipate within a process-based or collaborative or community-engaged project. Come on, you were nodding. You must have an interesting example, even if it's a speculative one or one anchored in your experience.
Well, quite a positive experience I've had recently was more around an event, but it was a very participatory experience where we had this it was a very popular exhibition, and it was something to encourage the local community to come in. And it's actually on at the moment. It's called Home Zone, and it's the Fashion Museum's exhibition, and I felt that we had to do almost very little to get people to come in and be a part of it, and it was just amazing for them to see the positive way that people responded to it. And we just asked people to come in something that they had made themselves, and people didn't know who I was, that I had facilitated this, and I wore this 70s frock that I hadn't made myself, but throughout the evening people kept on coming up to me and asking me how I'd made it and how I'd, what was the material, and sort of had to say, oh, I'm sorry I didn't do it, but it made me realise that there were 200 women there, and they're all strangers to each other, and throughout the night they just shared these stories, and there were things that their grandmothers had made, and their mothers had made, and that, they brought all these personal stories to that, and it was just absolutely amazing.
And I wasn't there on that night, but my encounter of that project was through the Facebook postings that the DAS put up, and there was this amazing stream of so many numbered women. They all had, it was kind of like beauty pageants, but not, in that everyone had a number. Yeah. But posing in their outfits that they were deeply, deeply proud of. And I think it's safe to say there's a mixed level of skill base in terms of sewing and design. But everyone was deeply, deeply excited to be able to show off this creative project of theirs or of a family member. And there were very heated exchanges on the Facebook page if any of the numbers or the names were wrong or there wasn't the right detail there.
They took a lot of ownership of it.
Majorly. And like, why am I not up there? So, in terms of a community engaged project that absolutely somehow just, channeled into a real well of commitment and interest, I think that's it's a really nice example.
I think there's a lot of fear when you undertake these things. For me, that was a really new thing to do. With that, and just seeing how people actually are really willing to participate, and when you talk about that process-based things, and a person that often pops into my head is like, who, you are doing it for the community, but are they going to be engaged? So it's I think people are always really wanting to, that they're asking for it and they're hungry for it. So I think it's worth taking that step, and even if it's frightening. Yeah.
So that was kind of quite a sort of a halcyon or a feel-good project. I wonder, would anyone have any experiences that they'd like to share of where participation or community engagement has been chewier or has tried to address issues that there are perhaps more complex scenarios or tensions or that need to be kind of owned and attended to within projects? Is it too early in the day to be airing any laundry of this persuasion?
Either I've got more of a question.
Yeah, go agree.
The barricade work that you showed from the Morrisons seems to me, it was a great project and it looked fantastic. I didn't see it myself, but the logistics of that and making that and deconstructing it, and it's only there for a day. I'm just interested to hear from you maybe around issues of resourcing for that. It seems like such sort of a monumental and impressive project, but it's only there for a day and it's not publicised and no one gets to see it. So I guess what I'm asking is kind of what's the point? Is that more for the artist or is it actually about engagement?
I think that, it's different. It's a very particular type of engagement, and I think in terms of resourcing, I don't know the project cost of that one, but I know that it was staffed by a crazy number of volunteers from Massey University and others, so a lot of art students in terms of the actual constructing of it, and the materiality was all from the dump and other kind of refuse and recycling outfits went back afterwards. So I think where possible there wasn't purchasing of that kind of, it was loaning or at the very worst kind of renting. But I think it was still experienced. It was estimated it was experienced by something like 15 to 20,000 people. There were events going on around central Wellington on that time, so I think it was an unsuspecting audience, but I think that was perhaps one part of the point of the work, that it was such a jarring encounter, and that there's that element of surprise encounter, which is a dynamic form of sort of viewership, where that work came under quite a lot of kind of criticism, was that it felt like it could have happened anywhere. So in terms of its site relationality, that it felt like it was formal rather than contextual, and that was held as a criticism against this work. But then I guess I think there's different ways of working and different ways of engaging with the issues or politics of site. And in a way, the fact that that was located as a sort of a barricade, but in sort of government land between the Arts Agency and the ex-Ministry of Defence buildings, there was something going on there. Whether it was intentioned or not, I don't know. but I know Claire Doherty's spoken a lot about the importance or the value of myth and word of mouth in relation to temporal projects as well. So one audience is the one that encountered it physically and directly, but there's also a ripple audience of those that hear about it through other people's anecdotes, water cooler conversations. I was riding my bike through central Wellington, holy hell, what was that all about? So I'm not at all sort of discounting your question.
No, I was interested in the conversation around it.
Absolutely, because it took a truckload, literally, well, more than one truckload, to make that happen. They've done similar projects. They did one in Bristol where they fabricated a turning over of a ginormous lorry out of which spilled, a ton of cut flowers. And so there was just this massive avalanche, which was placed and curated, of course, of kind of flowers tumbling out of this truck that people were respectful of or sacrosanct about for an hour, and then people started taking the flowers home. So there was this crazy kind of from central Bristol, everyone with flowers tucked into their bike carriers or out the cars at their windows of their car. So they quite like that big spectacle and a gesture which is kind of bold and incredibly kind of commanding, and then just dissipates. Yeah, which is completely the antithesis to this kind of local time project where the artists are interested in providing some form of service, but also inviting us to seriously ask questions about, and of course, the politics of ownership of water was, key to this work. And this being like a gesture of generosity through the infrastructure of 4 or 5 different galleries that were involved in the triennial. But also it was, yes, it was a gesture of generosity, but it was asking us to ask ourselves, pretty chewy questions as well. Jeff?
Just that element of surprise that you mentioned before in these sort of temporal exhibitions, that would seem to me to be a key element of their success. Is that your experience?
I think, but I think as well, definitely within, for example, Maddie Leach's project and how she's worked in the past, she's used a lot of placement of page works and text works within newspapers to kind of start a bubble of curiosity and interest and excitement prior to or as part of the project's evolution. So I think you can have the wham bam, thank you ma'am kind of surprise element, but you can also kind of nourish and feed and start to elicit kind of curiosity of your viewership or your your readership in the case of text or based works. So I think it depends what you want the project to do and how you want it to evolve and what kind of lifespan it has as well. There was a project called I can't remember the full title, but it's something around good oil that Maddie's done up at the Galbraith Brewster Art Gallery, where she has been, there were letters to the editor as part of that project, which included some really crazy editorialising by the paper about the project on top of the letters, which was fascinating but really quite bizarre. But her talking in New Plymouth about thinking about what the good oil is a fairly interesting and again contentious aspect of what artists can do, is to ask kind of poetic, through poetic means, ask really chewy and political questions. Whereas that's a slow burn project. There's almost no big wham bam spectacular visible aspect to it. But I think from my perspective, both methods are completely successful. Yeah. Or can be, not always. Yeah. Any other? We've got 5 more minutes or so.
I was just going to say, it was more of an observation than anything, I think. Contemporary exhibitions I've been involved in, it's like you don't sort of curate in a vacuum in a museum. You've got all the other departments involved as well. So you're busy trying to pull something together, and meanwhile marketing saying, so how are we going to market this?
Yeah, what's that image?
I don't know. Yeah. And in the registrar saying, I need an insurance value for your artworks, and I'm trying to do that, and we're not quite sure what we're getting at the moment. Yeah. And it all just, it can I mean, there's a big tension within the museum or your art gallery, and that can be quite exhausting. And maybe it's a hurdle, but you need to get your energy up before you start jumping over it. You want to build up your energy and then go for it.
And I think perhaps talks to the regularity by which you can embark on these projects within galleries or museum infrastructures for which they're not normal practice, or but I think there's also after your team of colleagues have engaged with one of these projects, the next time that they start to work on it, there might be raising of the eyebrows, but they're a little bit more warmed up to the ambiguity that kind of can exist. But I completely recognise it can be deeply frustrating and incredibly stressful.
You've got to ride the wave a wee bit, don't you?
Yeah. And I have to confess, in terms of the lion's share of temporal and participatory projects that I've been involved with have happened during gallery redevelopments, whereby you're absolutely keen and encouraged to be spreading your kind of energies and establishing relationships and off-site programming. But what becomes incredibly challenging is then what can you bring of all of the benefits of that into running a building-based institution at the same time. But that's where I haven't spoken about them directly, but that's where I think artisan residency projects can be incredibly useful structures through which to enable those kind of discursive and participatory energies to still have a strong place within the gallery and museum, but maybe aren't quite as kind of demanding or as taxing as doing kind of massive projects off-site as well. Also, a lot of people choose to align with other festivals or events that are happening within an annual programming that might key into city resources, which can also help. I know that Creative Communities grants get used liberally for projects like that, but obviously, and there is the challenge if you are in an institution that is already in receipt of regular funding from Creative New Zealand, if you want to go for additional funding from them, you have to demonstrate that that's not part of your core business. So that often leads to kind of creative massaging of how these projects can be contextualised so that they can be funded. Yeah.
I certainly think that can be a challenge, is when you are looking at spaces that you regularly occupy or fill or accommodate with various projects, and you're going out, how do you actually manage that process where the resources might not necessarily increase?
But you can also rethink how you use your spaces in terms of process-based working. And it was interesting, and again, I don't think completely successful, but this year within the Auckland Triennial, massive amount of their top floor real estate was given over to changing projects led by university art schools and architecture programs that were representing very, very intense collaborative site engaged projects thinking about Auckland City. But what often, if the activity isn't of a certain density and vibrancy, what you get is the remnant of a party that you haven't been invited to, and the floor's a bit sticky and you can't quite get what was going down. So there's a tricky balance there in terms of supporting and enabling process-based working within the museum or gallery, and kind of making people feel that they've kind of missed out on something rather than getting extra access to a dynamism and an energy. So it's not easy. I'm not saying it's easy, but what I hope through the case studies that we've looked at and some of the discussion is to just kind of really underline the value of working in this way. And I know many of you are involved in institutions that have been or are about to go through periods of building refurbishment, earthquake strengthening, Greg. And so this is an ideal time to be able to test and trial different structures and formats of off-site working. Anyway, thank you very much for listening and your comments.